We're about to kick off our first session of the day, and it's a cracker. We all know of the dark web as this mysterious corner of the internet where all the bad stuff happens. Often the things that you don't think pertains to you or your charity as well. Well, think again. John Evans from Skurio joined us to help you understand why the dark web poses a threat to your organization and what you can do about it. So before I hand over to John, notable points. If you want to ask a question, we'll have sort of 10-15 minutes for that at the end. You can do so by hitting the Q&A button. It tends to be on the center right of your console that pops up at the bottom. If it's not there, look for the button that looks like two conversation text boxes overlapping. Hit that, add a question in, and also, keep the discussion going in the chat. Feel free to bounce some ideas off you. So over to John. I'll catch you in just a bit. Enjoy.
Hello, and thank you for tuning into today's webinar on dark web monitoring. My name is John Evans. I'm one of the intelligence analysts at Skurio, specializing in open source intelligence. The aim of today is to help you understand the dangers of the dark web and why it's such an important aspect of threat monitoring for cybersecurity. We're going to go through some examples which you've maybe not seen or considered previously, so this should give you a broader perspective of what's out there beyond the usual narrative. We'll go through some things like fraud and attack planning, and there'll be some time for questions at the end. Now, a bit of housekeeping first of all. This is not a what is the dark web session. So we've all seen that pretty iceberg picture many times before, so we're not going to start with that. And you won't see any cheesy photos of hackers wearing hoodies in dark rooms today either, because that's just frankly Hollywood rubbish. So any screenshots and images you see are real world examples of illegal activity. But one point I will clarify is that when we refer to dark web today, we mostly mean information available via the Tor browser. Now, there's a lot of different terms used, so you'll see darknet, blacknet, etc. But today we'll be mostly focusing on Tor marketplaces and forums, with some deep websites included. We'll also cover a few sites on the normal internet or surface web and how they relate to the dark web marketplaces themselves. And finally, you'll notice that many of the usernames and URLs have been obfuscated with red and black boxes. That's purely for security and because we don't want to give them free advertising or to be encouraging people to visit them if they don't know what they're doing. So let's kick off with the dark web dilemma. If we briefly talk about the facts, it's quite obvious now, as you can't really escape the sort of waterfall of articles and white papers that talk about it, that data breaches are happening around the world. But it's a big problem. 80% of hacks are from stolen credentials, with an estimated 2 billion of which now on the dark web. Now, passwords and emails are one thing, but we're now even starting to see health records for sale. So that's some of the most personally sensitive information being traded and used for things like blackmail. Now, the healthcare sector in particular has been hit the hardest, with the average data breach costing around $6 million. Now, the time it's taking for breaches to be detected is also alarmingly high, with it taking an average of 206 days to identify a breach. So the scale of the problem is vast, and unfortunately the cybersecurity community doesn't really seem to be keeping up. So why is this? Well, this brings us to the problem. These are some of the comments and thoughts from our personal interactions with customers. It's not at the top of your list. You've got a huge to-do list, and dark web is pretty late to the party. You probably don't think you're a target when really you've no idea. It gives IT a headache. It gives compliance a nightmare, frankly. The idea of letting staff anywhere near Bitcoins and Tor browsers just scares them. Admittedly, many people, particularly powerful executives, may not fully understand it, and you may not think there's anything you can do. And as we've seen in many companies, you might have a dark web person, in-house or contracted, who does dark web stuff for you. Now, when you list it like that, you start to see how much opportunity there is for criminals to get ahead of the game, which is why we really need a shift in culture and attitude when it comes to the dark web. Now, take for example those organizations that are trying to tackle the dark web issue using a dark web person. This is a very short list of some of the most popular dark web sites and marketplaces. Now, imagine each of these as being similar to, say, eBay. For some of them, you'll need an email address and have to pay a fee to enter. Once you're in, you need to stay in. You need to log in regularly, contribute to posts, put up ads, or purchase content, or risk your account being deleted and starting all over again. So from this list alone, you'd need 16 accounts and would have to log in to each of these regularly. Now, the other issue is that even that initial process takes time. So this is a screenshot of Yellow Brick Road. Now, to register for this site, you need a referral from an existing vendor to invite you in. So this means worming your way into the dark web community on forums and message boards until you get allowed access. So this means that your dark web person is effectively just being paid to log in and out of these markets all day long, which isn't an efficient use of time. So what needs to happen? Well, in our view, automation is vital. Otherwise, it's like searching the internet without Google. It's slow and it's tedious. But crucially, that automation must be backed up with knowledge. So having a solution in place like Breach Alert, which makes searching the dark web really safe and easy, really does make that process much smoother, and it minimizes the risk to your network and staff. Now, a couple of other points before we move on. When you do start to tackle the dark web, think about what you want to achieve. We've spoken to so many companies who want a dark web monitoring solution, but they haven't actually got a plan other than it just appearing on a to-do list. And finally, as we'll come on to shortly, the bad guys can be caught. We've done it, the police have done it, so let's not allow them to operate with impunity. Our first example section is on serious crime. First and foremost, let's talk about the obvious: drugs, weapons, and child pornography. It's not pleasant, but it's out there, and many of the dark web presentations we've seen tend to focus on this for scare factor. But unless you're working for the police, most of this stuff won't have any impact on your organisation whatsoever, so it's not going to be our focus today. But the other reason I mention this is that as I come on to some of the examples, it's worth noting that many of the things that we see being sold, discussed and traded are normally alongside some of the unpleasant things I've just mentioned. So whilst these sinister products aren't of interest, the areas where they're sold could be. Take this marketplace, for example. This one's called Tochka and is focused on the sale of drugs. So as you can see here, there's some adverts for cocaine and every other awful drug you could wish for listed on the right hand side. But if we dig a little bit deeper, we start to find credit cards and leaked information. So quite often hackers may even be found chatting or advertising on child pornography sites, not because they're into that, but just because it keeps them safe. Now we'll talk about fraud. Credit card fraud is rife on the dark web. We've spoken with some major banks around the world, and surprisingly, many of them had no idea this was even happening. But it's remarkably easy to get hold of a credit card on the dark web. So this site here is called Valid Fraud, and it lists credit cards and social security numbers available for purchase in order of BIN number, which are the first 6 digits which identify which bank the card is with. Now this is a problem for the financial industry, but probably not that unexpected. But this next example is a little bit different and is something which is growing in popularity. So this vendor is offering a PSD template, so that's an editable Photoshop file of a Virgin Media utility bill. Now when we look at the post in greater detail, we can see that the vendor is offering a very legitimate looking document. Now, this clearly could pose problems for Virgin, but in terms of the use case for this, these documents could be used to open accounts, as forms of ID or proof of address, so this could be very problematic for those offering financial services who would ask for this type of document in, say, background checking. Now we can't identify the vendor from the post, so you might think, well, what can we do? Well, fortunately, a lot of these vendors are lazy. They do a great job of hiding on the dark web, but then they just copy and paste the ad everywhere. So if I just do a Google search for one of the lines of text, we find that same line of text verbatim on an ad on the surface web. Now this brings me to a website called Driver's License Template, and they're offering documents for Bank of America, HSBC, and lots more. So it's highly likely to be the same individual. The difference being, this is now a normal website, so we can investigate this a little bit further. If I bring up the Whois record for the domain, we can see the website was registered by Amy Rower, who is very easy to identify online. Now, don't get me wrong, poor Amy here has probably been picked at random and isn't the threat actor, but it's a start. And quite often if they've advertised on, say, 20 different sites, they'll slip up somewhere, and this is how we can start to track them down. Now, another really easy way to catch the perpetrator is through metadata. If they've uploaded hundreds of documents, I'd be surprised if they remember to remove their username and details every single time. So once you have that information, you can run a quick search on social media, and it shouldn't take too long to start drawing some connections. Now, on the charity side of things, this is an example from Icarus Market, where there's an offering for forged American Red Cross cards. These are identity cards that can be used to prove that someone has attended a first aid at work course or has a particular certification from the Red Cross, which could be very damaging for them in terms of reputation and credibility, but also means that those who perhaps would have paid for these certifications annually are no longer going to have to do so. Really, the interesting thing is that they may not have even had to have committed a crime to obtain the documents in the first place, but by scanning these and making them editable or forged, and above all convincing, they could be causing a serious headache for a lot of organisations in the UK and around the world. This next section is loosely focused on physical goods. The counterfeit goods trade generates $800 billion in revenue annually. Now just let that sink in for a moment. That means that businesses are losing revenue by a margin that they have no measure of whatsoever. If a product is selling for $50 a unit and someone sells them on the dark web for $25 a unit, their sales drop and they have absolutely no gauge as to why. Now when we talk about counterfeit goods, I don't just mean your dodgy mate selling Gucci handbags in the back of a van. We've seen the wholesale of iPhones, Androids, tablets and other expensive goods, all for hugely reduced prices. Now whilst you hopefully wouldn't trust a mobile phone vendor on the dark web, if they bulk buy iPhones at $50 a unit and open an Amazon store, how are we to tell the difference? You may be tempted to think, okay, but I get that, but we're a charity. Well, sadly, these issues affect charities in much the same way. Social engineering relies on abusing our sense of trust and goodwill. When a major crisis or national appeal takes place, people follow links on social media, hand over money, thinking that they've done a good thing, and in reality, the charities continue to suffer. Criminals really do have no morals, and the extent of this often goes beyond just a few listings on eBay. As soon as a new appeal is launched, entire websites are often set up to steal money that should be going to good causes. The City of London Police stated in 2017 that they had shut down over 30,000 of these such sites, and that it's a constant battle to stop this type of activity. Our next example takes us to Nightmare Market, which is about as pleasant as it sounds. I've searched for the term NHS, and immediately I was presented with pages and pages full of drugs like tramadol and naproxen. Now, these could be counterfeit tablets and potentially dangerous to the buyer's health, but let's look a little bit deeper. The vendor says sourced from the NHS, and the boxes look pretty genuine. And they've made 580 sales. Now, that's a substantial number, and it suggests it's unlikely to be someone going to their GP and faking a headache once a week. It's quite possible this is an insider or someone working for the manufacturer themselves. Now, how this would be investigated would surely be down to the NHS and police, but at a time when budgets are stretched, these kinds of abuses can be really damaging. This is also where knowledge comes into play, as many of these drugs will often have street names, which makes them much more difficult to identify. Now, clearly when we talk about the NHS in the current climate, it's difficult not to mention COVID-19, and so we conducted some research to identify changes in the dark web market. Criminal marketplaces have been impacted in much the same way that Amazon has. The vendor may be selling illegal products, but they still take themselves seriously as businesses and providers of a service. So we've observed notices about slower delivery times and seen some markets temporarily shutting down. Unfortunately, that is offset by an equal rise in opportunists. So here you can see a vendor on Versus Market promoting drugs at a COVID promotional rate, and home testing kits being sold at over €393 a piece. Now, this is a particularly disturbing find given the context of health workers struggling to even get testing for themselves. Looking into this one a little bit further, from research we identified that these particular kits are almost certainly linked to a criminal case that appeared around the same time, where unauthorised test kits were being purchased from China at 50 cents each. And it demonstrates just how low criminals are willing to go when at a time like this, they're not only ripping people off, but the tests probably don't even work, putting lives in danger. Now, putting COVID-19 back aside for a moment, another popular one is the sale of false identity documents. Here we've identified a post using our own digital risk protection solution. The vendor is offering UK passports, but oddly mentions selfies. Quite often when people pass their driving test or get citizenship, they'll post to Facebook holding up their ID. Stupid, yes, but now this is being harvested and sold. In preparing the presentation today, one particular example I saw was of a young woman doing a, quote, passport selfie. When I reverse searched the image, I discovered it was from the identity verification step of a mobile app. And this could have been chosen at random, but more likely suggests a vulnerability in the application and where they actually stored the selfies. Next, we'll talk specifically about customer data breaches. You only need to type the word breach into Google and you're flooded with news stories about how customer data has leaked and their organisation is left having to pick up the pieces. But sometimes these breaches aren't necessarily their fault. The reason we at Skurio heavily promote looking outside of your network is because a lot of things are outside of your control, particularly when it comes to your customer accounts. Now let's be realistic. You may have excellent network security, strict control of your employees, you've done all the right stuff, well done. But can you say the same for your customers? Do your thousands of customers all behave responsibly when it comes to password management? Probably not as a whole. Now, if we look at all these processes you've hopefully implemented for your staff, so things like complex passwords, two-factor authentication, deleting old accounts, etc., ask yourself whether this rings true for the customer-facing side of your service. The sites we use often have options for safer login or suggestions to update your password, but these things aren't enforced, and it is a tough call. If a customer wants to buy a product but can't log in, there's a potential loss of sale. And in the charity case, it's just the same. If somebody wants to go to your website to make a donation and they can't access it, the same loss happens, which is understandable. We're all consumers, we've all got accounts for Amazon, Boohoo, Spotify, etc. So we know this stuff happens and how frustrating it can be when you have to change your password in a rush. But the reason this is so important to understand though, is that if a customer reuses an old password, even with all the best complexity rules, it doesn't take a genius to work out what that password may be, because most users will have already been included in one or more breaches in their lifetime. So if Stacey Blogs here has been in 3 password breaches already, which show her using variants of Chelsea123, if a threat actor then wanted to guess a password for a site that asks for, say, an uppercase letter, I'm pretty sure they're going to be able to work this out within 3 guesses. So what happens then? The customer logs in, discovers all their gift cards or points have been used up, their information has been stolen, and orders have been placed in their name. Now, it's all their fault, but your problem to deal with. A one-off occurrence is one thing, but if you're seeing a lot of this and the ICO comes knocking, you need to be seen to be acting responsibly and in the customer's best interests to protect them. There was a prime example of this in March 2020, where Tesco announced they would be reissuing 600,000 club cards, likely at great expense. Now, what happened here is that because some customers may have fallen victim to an online fraud case involving another database of stolen usernames and passwords from a different platform, they've been tried out on their website and there was a risk of people using the same password. If you use an automated solution like Breach Alert to search for your company domains and IP addresses, you can easily detect a data breach concerning assets by looking for mentions and matches, which it will do very effectively. So here, just as a random example, underneath there's a breach that was in the news a few years ago for Woman and Home magazine, and we're able to quickly identify where it's being sold and discussed. But with customer data, there may not be any mention of your organization at all because your company name doesn't feature in their email addresses or details, and you can't search for all of Hotmail or all of Gmail. So how can you protect your customers? You don't want to become personally responsible for every single lazy customer, and you don't want to be digging into their personal lives without good reason to do so, of course. So what we're now doing to tackle this issue is asking organizations to use their client databases, which could be in the hundreds of thousands or millions of customer addresses, and use this as a reference table. If Breach Alert identifies a breach list of 1,000 email addresses and passwords, and let's say, for example, a certain threshold or even 100% of those 1,000 email addresses are all your clients and customers, you can be certain that that list has originated from your organization, allowing you to react and take appropriate action. You can also take the same approach with personal data you have for your employees, so addresses, health records, etc. We also see a lot of combo lists, which are quite randomly aggregated lists of user information. So being able to determine whether this information is relevant to you is really important, again, because there are no obvious references to your company name. Now, as much as I am encouraging you to take responsible steps to protect your staff and customers, in doing so, you are going to expose a greater detail about their lives and behaviors. So, just as a word of warning, I want to point something out which should be obvious but can be easily forgotten. Bad people tell lies. So, if you see someone's password has allegedly been leaked, or that they are being accused of being a member of an extreme group, don't take that as fact just because it's on the dark web or it's for sale. If you make an accusation against an individual based on wafer-thin evidence, you can cause a lot of harm and concern. We've seen instances of smear campaigns against executives where they've been accused of everything from being members of child sex trafficking rings, far-right political groups, and totally fictitious passwords and documents. This is a very clever play by the bad guys. They just make it up, and because there's nothing to stop them doing that. What's important is how you handle this information when it comes to light. But you have to ask, who would actually sign up to a porn site using their work email? And can you imagine how an employee would feel about their boss asking them about a Pornhub account? So, investigate, challenge, and ensure you have all the facts before jumping to a conclusion, as disinformation, or fake news it's often referred to, can reap havoc if it's not contained properly. So we'll now talk about information trading, certainly one of the biggest threats from a cybersecurity perspective. There's lots of ways information leaks can happen: insiders, unsecured information in the cloud, cyber attacks, third-party breaches, etc. But let's look at what is then done with the information they've illegally obtained and how they will sell or distribute the information. When a vendor wishes to sell dumps or fulls, quite often they'll want to prove their claims are legitimate by posting a sample. This sample could be a set of 50 or so email addresses and passwords that they offer for free, just to show what kind of quality of content they have. Quite often, this information is also posted on normal websites such as Pastebin or Twitter, with links provided to the vendor's dark web post. Here you can see a link to a YouTube video where the sample has been recorded, presumably to help avoid detection. Now, something we've developed at Skurio is the ability to analyse that sample data to show if it's new or old. Now, as you saw earlier, there are literally billions of compromised accounts out there, so it's not hard for someone to just grab a couple of really old accounts, stick them together, and put them up for a fee in Bitcoin. So let me explain that in a little bit more detail. Here we have a dump of passwords, and this is generally how they'll appear. We can take the associated email addresses and check to see what breaches they've appeared in, and this allows us to understand how the leak occurred and whether we need to be concerned. So if we see that they were only included in the MySpace breach 10 years ago, we can think, okay, we know all our passwords have been changed since then, and it's highly unlikely they've gained access to any of our data, so we don't need to worry. But if we see accounts which haven't shown up in any of the major breaches before, this is new information and we need to act quickly. This contextual analysis is really helpful when a big breach is uploaded on the dark web, particularly because a lot of the high-profile ones we tend to see and read about tend to be compilation lists of old breaches stuck together. Sometimes the passwords are posted as hashes, and I'm certainly no encryption expert, but I can easily go to a site such as MD5 Cracker and quickly turn that into an actual password. So here I've taken the hash of characters on the left-hand side, and now we have a password for the dating site Zeusk. Once the password has been leaked from a corporate account, the simplest fix is clearly to change the password, but the problem doesn't stop there. So let me introduce our friend Steve as an example. Steve has a password that he thinks is pretty clever, so he uses it on pretty much everything. In work, he just changes the last digit every few months. Now, this is really bad practice, and it doesn't take much for the threat actors to spot the pattern. Now his password is included in a breach which is being sold on Core Market. His employer forces him to use a new password, so he does and thinks nothing more of it. But now what the attacker will do with that password is then probe every form of social media and email account available to find a successful login, which they can then either exploit further or sell. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, I don't use social media, I've got two-factor authentication on my email, so why do I need to worry? But what about these? Our lives are so connected right now that once we go home, we sign up to hundreds of sites for offers, takeaways, short breaks, Black Friday deals, Christmas deals, you name it. These are the easy targets, the forgotten apps that you use once and uninstall. That 25% off pizza token that you use that same old password for, that Netflix trial which you cancelled after a month, this is how it all starts. Credential breaches get spoken about a lot, but there's good reason for it. Good password hygiene needs to take place at home as well as in the office. There are some other ways in which accounts may be exploited, so I've used our breach alert solution here to find any mentions of UK voucher codes or offers, and have found a result here for KFC. Someone is selling UK KFC accounts which are full of rewards and personal information. Now, KFC haven't suffered a data breach. What's likely happened is that someone who is in a different data breach has used the same password on the KFC Colonel's Club Rewards app. Now someone's getting a free meal. Here is a similar advert for Uber, except in this instance, they're offering unlimited rides. So this sounds a bit more sinister, and it may be that they've discovered a loophole in the app, which they're willing to share for a price. The point being that these organisations both haven't done anything wrong, but their customers are still at risk, which is why it's so important to have an awareness of how your organisation is mentioned on the dark web. Also remember, not everyone is looking to sell. Depending on the intent of the individual, the information may just be posted raw and available for everyone to see. This is a dark web site called SecureDrop. It is hosted in the dark web and allows you to send files securely to major news networks like Al Jazeera and the Associated Press. For example, if you wanted to whistleblow about an organization without leaving a footprint. Now, next is something a bit different, cyberattack planning. Clearly, the worst case scenario is your organization suffering a coordinated, aggressive, and complex cyber attack. You'll often have no idea it's coming, and the implications are huge. So, firstly, a lot of the attacks will be organized in closed channels, which we obviously can't monitor. That's the job for covert police. But for a lot of hackers, street cred means a lot to them, and they'll often encourage other hackers to support them. And if you're not looking, they could be planning an attack right under your nose. We've seen that some groups will actually post target lists online. So here you can see a Twitter account with a specific set of targets telling their community what to attack and when. Sometimes the basic information will be posted on social media with a link back to the safety of the dark web for full details. A recent example of this was the arrest of Julian Assange. As you can expect, this outraged many activists, and we can see here a dark web post urging supporters to share the target list posted on Pastebin. When we look at the Pastebin post, it states an attack date, the target list, their IP addresses, as well as even tutorials and how-to guides on how to carry out attacks. A first step in any cyber attack scenario is reconnaissance, and we've seen lots of recons being posted online. Now, a strong point I'd like to make at this stage is about takedowns and whether they are effective. So often we meet companies with this whack-a-mole mentality. If they're mentioned badly on any website, they just want to immediately get the lawyers and IT consultants to force a takedown of the information, continually trying to delete themselves from the internet. But what does that actually achieve? Here we can see a, quote, full recon of the Lib Dems website. This post is about 50 pages long. It lists all their IP addresses, servers, and what tools the attackers intended to use to attack them. Now, for security teams, this type of information is a dream come true. You know exactly what your enemy are going to do and when. Taking down that information will only force them to post it to somewhere you're not monitoring, and the information is already out there, so better with the devil you know. Otherwise, you're effectively tipping them off and shooting yourself in the foot. Now, of course, there are scenarios when takedowns are appropriate, which we and myself, we've been involved in many times. But if your organization has that whack-a-mole mentality first, maybe just think carefully about the approach in the future. So, to round off what's been a pretty dark subject, if you pardon the pun, there is some good news. The days of dark web bad guys being unstoppable are ending. We've seen many high-profile arrests. We've seen the shutdown of Alphabay, Hansa and Silk Road by the Dutch police. And even here at Skurio, we've been able to track down dark web vendors back to their home addresses and then pass the information across to police forces across Europe. More recently, we've seen the takedown of Dream Market. This site was hugely popular, and in dark web terms, this is like Amazon being suddenly switched off. It has a massive impact on the illegal trading of goods, and it really sends a message that they are no longer invincible. So, in summary, dark web monitoring isn't an option, it is a must. You may already be a target. Someone could be arrogantly posting about you right now because you're not even looking. Any organization could be affected, and we really do mean this. Often small to medium-sized entities are targeted purely because the threat actors know that targeting big organizations like Barclays and banks and global institutions, they are much harder to penetrate. Monitoring the dark web is difficult but not impossible, and with the right guidance and tools it can be a lot easier than you think. Always use an expert solution. Having a safe environment to view the content without the risk of encountering malware or very unpleasant images just makes the whole process much more manageable. It's also far more cost effective, and you gain much better insight by having experienced experts on hand. And finally, as I've just mentioned, dark web criminals can be caught. The more we, as business leaders and cybersecurity professionals, can do to combat criminals on the dark web, the better protected we will become both at work and in our personal lives. So finally, I'd like to thank you all very much for listening. I do hope you've taken a few points away to think about, and I'll now hand back to the team to open up the floor for any questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for that, John. I'd love to welcome John to join us for a live Q&A. John, how are you doing?
Yeah, pretty good, thanks. It's very strange listening to yourself for 25 minutes, but yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, I can't imagine it's something you ever get used to be honest. But look, that was great from my point of view. We do a lot of work around around cybersecurity, and often it can be seen as a bit of scaremongering. but the reality is that only 52% of charities actually see themselves as being at risk. And I think it's something like that presentation there that actually puts it into perspective a little bit, and like this is real, and it's become more and more real with a lot more people moving online now, with COVID and everything else that's going on. With more people are digital. Like we kind of get rid of one risk with COVID and getting ourselves operating correctly, and then another one pops up in the face of cybersecurity. We've had some great questions coming in, so
sure,
I'm going to fire a few at you if that's all right.
yeah, go ahead.
Great one to kick us off from Roger Priest. Hope I've pronounced that correctly. I agree with him in him saying that this was a brilliant presentation on the dark web. 100% agree. He then goes on to ask, why is this something that's not being discussed more widely?
Yeah, $1 million question, I think. Yeah, I don't think that things like Netflix, movies and things that are going on about the dark web at the moment has really helped. I think that the general perception is that it is, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, it is people in dark rooms with hoodies, and that it is purely the very extreme end of serious crime, distributing cocaine or rifles or what have you. But normal criminality is rife on that as well. I do think in terms of the companies that are out there that tackle the dark web, I'm not going to name any specifically, but I think that there are companies that are purely focused on the dark web, and therefore they've taken that kind of Hollywood style scare factor as well, because it makes them stand out. And if you type dark web company or something into Google, you'll find loads of these, and as soon as you go to it, you know what the website's going to look like. It's going to be all black with green writing, or so I think that, and certainly what we're trying to do on our side is just trying to make it a more of a serious part of cybersecurity, and try and remove and demystify it and get rid of that Hollywood drama.
Yeah, I totally get that. I mean, I think dark web, and I see that anonymous face.
Yeah.
As probably it's probably a lot of other people do as well. So it's great to see that. I think humanizing it a little bit and not sensationalizing it, which I think I tend to agree with you that a lot of these big Hollywood movies kind of do that. It's really quite important. Thanks for that. So next question from Steph Beeston Clark. What are the basic things small and tiny charities need to consider when looking into the cybersecurity? What can they do with very limited funds and budget for? How can they get started essentially?
Yeah. Well, you need to get a solution in place and definitely start with automation. So the reason that I brought up the dark web person point is that that tends to be where we see people start, and it's the most expensive way to start, in that people sort of organizations, they will speak to a company with a load of ex-military guys like myself, and they'll say, hey, and they'll charge them a fortune, and actually they're just being paid to do something very mandrolic. So if you're going to get something, have some objectives. So start small, like things like credential breaches, etc., data breaches, and have that in as a bit of a safety net. I'm not a marketing person myself, but I do know that Skurio have got some things going on for charities at the minute. So by all means, do get in touch with us for that. So yeah, just make sure you have an objective, start small, and definitely use automation, particularly if you have only got a small team. Don't get duped into having some guy who just sits in a corner with a hoodie on, so.
Great. Another question from an anonymous attendee. If I monitor the dark web and I come across illegal material, how can I protect myself from the risk of prosecution, as it could look like I'm a consumer of this illegal material?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so that's a really interesting question, actually, because that's something that we have to deal with. So first of all, one of the reasons that having a third party provider deal with the dark web is that it protects you from that, which is why outsourcing a lot of IT things is done in the first place, because from an insurance side and protection side, it really does protect you. In terms of where the red lines are, the main one is if you do decide to do that, if you see child pornography, you have to report that from a legal perspective, but realistically, you don't really want to get to the point of bumping into it. How we handle it is that we've got good connections with the National Crime Agency. So we had an instance where we were dealing with an incident where I think it was about 2 terabytes of data had been stolen and it was being put up for sale. So what we did is we had aliases and things that we whitelisted with the National Crime Agency. So we were liaising with law enforcement, and also to avoid a blue on blue. I know many instances where you've had, a CIA agent and an MI5 agent or what have you kind of bumping heads because they were both kind of working on the same case. And that kind of thing can happen. And the worst thing is that obviously if you think you're doing the right thing and then the police come knocking, but at the very basic level, log things. So it doesn't matter if it's dark web or any kind of cybersecurity based research. Take a screenshot, have a justification. Just to give you a horror story, even with the knowledge that I have, I was asked to go and look at some kind of, weirdly enough, anonymous chat rooms. So I was trying to worm my way in with those, and eventually they sent me a few links. But one of them was actually they were just trolling me, and they sent me a child porn website link. Fortunately, it was just the login page, so there was nothing too unpleasant on there. But later down the line, in 2-3 years' time, if it's brought up an investigation and the police say to me, "Hey, John, why were you on a child pornography site in 2015?" I would need to be able to bring that up. So log it, take a screenshot, have the justification, a witness, or what have you, just so you've got a bit of evidence and backup as to why you were there.
Great, thanks a lot for that, John. Really, really in-depth answer. Really appreciate it. I think that answers Joseph's question as well, which was the next one, which is if we use an external IT company, would that be their issue?
Yeah. So I mean, that's why I think, outsourcing of IT is done in that general way. But I think that outsourcing of dark web is definitely the way to go, unless you've got some very experienced guys in there, guys and girls. And yeah, I would just be very, very cautious about it if you want to do it yourself.
Thanks for that. We're getting a few questions in about from various different people about passwords, saying it's hard to get people to change them.
Yes,
do you have any advice for people who are struggling with password discipline, so to say?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes the military sort of mindset of me is just make it super complex. But I realize that's just not going to work for people. If Netflix wanted me to have, a 16-digit password, I'd probably never watch a movie again in my life, I think. So what I would say is try to enforce what you can. Multi-factor authentication. There are apps like Authy now, which are great, where when you go to log in, it just requires a second means of authorization, these kind of two-factor, etc. Because that's kind of more effective in some ways than the complex passwords. But the thing that we were talking about with the customer data breaches, where that becomes important is that if you want to have not too complex passwords, you just need to make sure that if it's going to be Jones 123, that Jones 123 isn't being used in other areas, because that Tesco club card example I gave is a perfect one where you're doing what you can, but because of their poor password management, you will suffer and the ICO will have questions. And to be honest, once it comes out in the media, if you're a charity and it comes up that 1,000 charity accounts have been exposed, the donations impact could be huge. So you've just got to balance it. It will always be a balancing act, and it's up to you as an organization, but just lean on the heavier side if you can.
Great, thanks very much, John. We've got another question from Amy Blake from Classrooms from Malawi. Are any particular types of charities or NGO more susceptible to cyber fraud than others?
I wouldn't have said so. I mean, doing some research before this, the first thing that struck me is the fact that charities, like I said in the presentation, are impacted in much the same way. I certainly didn't see a pattern, but what I would probably assess is that those that offer some kind of a product or service are potentially going to be more heavily impacted. If you've all got these kind of donation pages, there's a risk there. But like with the things like the Poppy Appeal, or if there are actual physical products that can be counterfeited, that kind of thing, I think there's a little bit more of a risk there because there's another monetary angle. But there's certainly no kind of wedge of that pie that is being affected.
Great, thanks. We're getting some more follow-up questions on passwords, clearly a hot topic. A couple about your thoughts on the likes of password saving apps like LastPass. I know Okta does something similar, or password vault software. What are your general thoughts on that, and should charities be using them?
Get on board. Get on board soon. It took me a while, I'll be honest, to get on board with the whole password management thing. I thought, no, I've got complex passwords or what have you, but it's just not possible to do it anyway other than a password manager. And once you have one and you start using it, And there's loads of them out there. Like you say, a couple of people mentioned LastPass. Dashlane is the one that I use. I've just helped my elderly relative who's very, she struggles with IT. I've just got her onto Dashlane, and it terrified her. She thought, no. She had this big book with 300 passwords in there. But now that I've set her up, she loves it because she never has to remember any. You just have one to remember. I feel like I should be getting a commission for Dashlane it. but honestly, you have to go down that route. If you will get left behind if you're not using that. So if you consider yourself a serious person from a cybersecurity perspective, get a password manager.
Great, thanks. And there's this "Have I Been Pawned" website out there which you can use to check yourself. Is that could charities see that as a surefire way that's enough to protect them from cyber criminals?
Yeah, I thought that might come up because so Have I Been Pwned, we use some of the data from Have I Been Pwned as well, because all the big high profile breaches you read about tend to get mentioned on there. But Troy Hunt, who runs Have I Been Pwned, he actually points out himself that most of his alerts come from data on the surface web, not the dark web. So his site often only gives notice once the affected company's gone public about the breach. So it's not the actual organic breach itself. So, or when someone in Troy's network has obtained the data from a dark website and the company won't reply to them. So while it's easy to use that, you're not picking up content directly from dark websites. So it could be several months before that data gets picked up. So I don't know how it's ended up that people have sort of started to perceive Have I Been Pwned as a dark web thing. That's purely credentials. If you haven't got any funds at all, it certainly can't hurt. I know people that use that on top of other services and stuff. But bear in mind all those other cases. And I think that particularly for charities, the issue is a very financially focused one. And you saw the exact examples of charities being affected. And Have I Been Pwned is not going to show you that if somebody's selling your products and stuff.
Great, thanks. We've got time for one more question, so we'll go with this one. How private is our own identity on the web? Is browsing history for sale? Is incognito browsing captured anywhere for sale? Should we move to sort of DuckDuckGo or equivalent?
So how private you are is going to be down to your own settings and how pedantic you are with it. I mean, to give you a prime example, I only discovered the other day that the Facebook mobile app, you see these nonsense things going around on Facebook where it says, oh, quick, you need to change this setting. It's some new conspiracy. I actually looked at that, and there was a setting on my phone that was tracking all of the data from 56 apps on my phone while I wasn't on Facebook. And that means that then I'm hoping that those other 56 apps are responsible from a security perspective. So what I would say is that the major companies like Google, Facebook, YouTube, etc., the settings are there now. They are there. You just really have to dig in and turn them all off. Using things like DuckDuckGo, they're great. What I would say is that if you can try and get into the habit of having something like DuckDuckGo as your default, so that things like Google aren't constantly picking up on all these different bits and pieces, but that's more just a targeted ads type thing. If you're talking about whether or not your stuff is for sale, the only way to know is if you start searching. And generally, you're going to get picked up in one of these third-party breaches. So a classic one is if you signed up to LinkedIn. LinkedIn was a really big issue because most people, it's a weird social media site whereby it seems to be the only one where it's acceptable to sign up with your work email. And so people get targeted on LinkedIn all the time. So yeah.
Makes sense. Well, look, thank you very much for joining us for the session that you ran, which was incredible, and spend a bit of time with us in the Q&A. I'll let you go and enjoy the rest of your day, but thanks very much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks, guys.